I'm giving you this perspective from 9,600 feet. And this is my office window when I'm up on Estes Mountain. We have a little small gold mine. And from here we are operating. This is Mount Greylock in the foreground. And in the distance are the White Cloud Mountains of central Idaho. The White Cloud Mountains started a lot of this controversy about mining in the wilderness and such. ASARCO discovered over $2 billion worth of molybdenum in the early 1970s in the White Cloud Mountains. And that began the wilderness kick because they didn't want him mining it. And so with that, now it's in a wilderness study area and it's being locked away. But anyway, from my little perch up here, we can see the whole world. This was actually a day in October. So it isn't the middle of the winter up there by any means. Anyway, here's some of the metals that I was talking about that China is the #1 producer of. The #2 producer in the world of silver, which is pretty incredible, the uses of silver that we need as an industrialized nation. The #1 producer is, of course, Mexico. And we're just falling behind the 8 ball on all of these necessary metals and minerals. Here's those metals and minerals that we are 100% dependent upon. It's interesting to note that several of these are found in Idaho. Fluorspar, in particular, niobium, or columbium as it's known. The rare earths, I think Idaho has the largest reserves of rare earths in the United States. And also of tantalum. Tantalum was mined in Valley County in the 1950s. These are all strategic metals. Thorium, we've got the largest resources of thorium. Now that's a radioactive metal that could be a replacement for uranium. You may have heard that, especially folks here in Utah and Arizona, that about 10% of the nation's uranium reserves were locked out from further exploration around the canyon lands. Of course, here in Utah, the Escalante Park has been locked up, key thrown away, huge coal reserves. Anyway, this is me out amongst my vein. Anyway, I come to this point where I'm somewhat vexed. I grew up in the mining business. I'm a professional land surveyor. And incredibly, these two professions collide. And in our many struggles in our Central Idaho Tea Party, where we work with many land issues, I started digging in to determine what it is we could do to fight back. But before we can go ahead, we really have to look back. How did America come to be the greatest power on this earth? And what was it that really kicked it off? And in an address to the Interior Department, the Government Land Office was established just 200 years ago, almost to the date. And at the 100-year anniversary, the centennial of the establishment of the Government Land Office, this Fred Dennett spoke. He was the commissioner of the General Land Office. And I need to give you a little bit of history. As a surveyor, the lands were sectionalized in the Louisiana Purchase and sold off during the War of 1812. And they needed to, the country found themselves in a typical situation, much as today. They were deep in debt. They were at war. They had to find ways to bring money into the exchequer. And so they began selling the lands. And to do that, they had to establish boundaries. They had to go out and survey and sectionalize the lands and break them into townships and offer them for sale. And this was wildly accepted as good practice. It brought money and it pushed people further west, and they began to settle the West. But it wasn't long before our country was in another war. It was during the Civil War that they really got some ideas of what they should be doing with land, and a novel idea came about. And let me read just some of the address from Fred Dennett. When this country was torn asunder by internal warfare, settlement was retarded because the man who could bear arms had gone to the war to fight instead to plow the fields. Cells were few and money was scarce, and those who saw the empty treasury before them kept urging on Congress the necessity of adhering to the money policy and standing by the theory of sale for the purpose of obtaining funds. But even in these dire times, when devastation was abroad and grim warfare was destroying the homes that had already been built, Congress thought free homes better for the nation than speculative purchases, and dreams of a populous West overcame the fear of an empty exchequer. This critical period of our history saw the passage of the Free Homestead Act and the full appreciation of the theory of development. It is not considered desirable to tax even the mineral resources of the United States to meet the extraordinary expenses of those days. The tendency was to hold that their future development under as liberal a policy as possible would be of greater assistance to the country in the end than the immediate revenue which might be received. The problems of the public lands was the nation's problem. The era of sale waned and the era of settlement advanced. The problem of disposition was thus solved by the conclusion that the best interests of the country demanded the encouragement of the settlement under conditions of free homes and free rights rather than the filling of the treasury by money collected from the pioneer and the developer. It is from these roots that most of the West was settled, and their expectations were incredibly rewarded as giving the land away to people who would develop the land, build their homes, raise their families, brought money to a struggling nation after the Civil War, but it also established the pioneership that many of us owe our heritage to in the great Western lands. People came to settle, and when people came to settle, towns grew up, and industry began to find its way into every little community. Here's some of the statistics on settlement from homesteads during this time. Also, during this time, or shortly thereafter, they passed, we all know about the Fifth Amendment. It's important because the ownership of property is fundamental to the ability for people to create wealth for themselves, for the individual. The speculation that went on after the War of 1812 showed that, the United States was better to give land away to those who would work it, take their 160 acres and make something, rather than to send it off to speculators who would buy and trade it up. And it's under this distinction that once it's your property, it's private. It cannot be taken without due compensation. And we're seeing a real problem these days with your rights, your property rights, being taken every day by the government for whatever national whim of the day it might be. Where I live in Custer County, our county is the size of Connecticut. We don't have a traffic light in the entire county, and only 3% of our county is held in private hands. So that's 3% of the tax base that we have to draw from. And most of our neighbors, everybody's neighbor, is the federal government. And they have not been a very good neighbor. In 1866, to accommodate the needs of the settler, Congress passed Act 2477. Now, this is the entire text of the Congressional Act. It's nothing like the acts today. I bet even in those days they were able to read such lengthy acts of Congress. Anyway, the right-of-way for the construction of highways across public lands not otherwise reserved for the public purpose is hereby granted. This very rule is under attack. It was repealed in 1964. It's now under litigation in many small communities, especially in the state here of Utah. I believe 22 of the 29 counties have joined in a suit against the federal government, who is now trying to take back public access into your public lands. They're doing it to us in Custer County. They're shutting off opportunity for further mineral exploration, for harvesting timber on forest lands, and they're running, of course, the ranchers off the range. And they don't have that right, but they are sure trying everything they can to impoverish these small communities of which I'm a part of. Well, this is the little ghost town of Custer. This was probably taken in the 1920s. The town of Custer was founded in 1876, just shortly after George Armstrong Custer was killed at the Battle of Little Bighorn. And it was a mining boom town. An incredible amount of gold was taken from the ledges that were found on the mountaintops. And it brought people to settle these lands, people to call this their home. And even though it's way up in the mountains, it was home for thousands of people. This would not be possible today. These lands have all reverted back to the federal government, and it's no more than just a tourist attraction. It's kind of sad because it was by the sweat of the brow and the opportunity that all who aspired to find their fortune left the easy life and headed out west to build little towns like this all over America, particularly here in the West. This is a picture of some of the miners at the Lucky Boy mine. It's taken about 1902. And I just die a little bit each time I see this because I look into the faces of those men in that picture and I see that we have greatly forsaken the opportunities that they had given to us. Every one of those men worked in that mine. They got there on their own behalf. They didn't get there on any federal aid program. There were no tax credits for gold miners, no government stipends or grants. And they worked the land and they got their small wages, but their wages were paid in gold and silver. And so it's a lesson that we can learn today that as we've seen the value of our money squandered, our rights squandered, the opportunities that we've had as Americans squandered, and lost to some idealism about the environment and saving the planet. My particular area is under siege by this kind of idealism. And it's unfortunate because of the problems that we have environmentally. They've all been caused by crusading environmentalists. I tell people there were a heck of a lot more salmon up the Salmon River when there were a heck of a lot more gold miners. And it's true. Now they're protecting the bull trout, and the bull trout, being a predatory species, is wiping out native cutthroats. We have a wolf problem, as you may have heard. They've introduced the wolf, and now our once majestic elk herds are gone, literally. It's sad to see. I was talking to a friend the other day who was on a wolf hunt, and they were up one of the streams here nearby to this location. 4 dead elk killed by wolves, you know, not consumed. They kill mostly for sport. The elk herds are now in small little pods of maybe 30. They're all run very hard. Most of the cows slough their calves before they even get to springtime. They need to see that side of the equation too. And our majestic forests up in the central Idaho highlands are devastated by beetle. In 1989, I pointed this out to a local forest ranger that there was a small grove of timber that was infected and dying, and that they ought to try to cut that out and get it out of there. Unfortunately, it was right next to the Salmon River, and he told me, oh, you know, we can't cut trees within 300 feet of the river. And so today our entire forest is devastated. It's about 90% dead. And this is all from people who don't know how to manage our forest lands because they never grew up in Idaho. They've never seen it for real. They've learned about it in a book, and most of them are from out of town, from back east. This is the General Custer Mill. It was built incredibly by a young man at the time who had worked for George Hearst, who was the big mining magnate who made several of the discoveries, the Comstock, Butte, Montana. George's son Randolph later became the San Francisco Examiner empire, owner of the empire. Anyway, this fellow who built the mill, they built it mostly in 1 year, took 175,000 bricks that they made on site. And you know, it was a day when if you could think it, you could do it. You could build it. You could make it happen. Kind of the peak of the Victorian age when you know, the steam engine ran supreme, and a man's ability to make it happen was all that it took, and somebody to finance it. This is the flywheel that ran the anvils that crushed the ore. Much of the ore at that time was running about 30 ounces of gold per ton. They took about $8 million off this ledge from 1881 to 1905. And that's when gold was $20 an ounce and silver about $60 an ounce. So it's you can see that it's quite a piece of machinery. You've got to realize too that we're 400 miles from Salt Lake. The rail hub ended at Blackfoot, Idaho, and another 200 miles. These were carried on mule train. A special wagon was built to haul this into two pieces, as it was too heavy to carry on any single wagon. And out there through the deserts of Idaho and the lava flows, a lightning storm came up and hit one of these pieces of iron, killed all 6 of the mules. So here they're stranded out in the middle of the desert, trying to find 6 mules, you know, to bring this thing back together. So there's always been these kinds of challenges, but there's been always these kind of men that would rise to the challenge and make things like this happen. So as the mine got started, communities grew up. People came. When you read our history, and we have a fabulous history that's being forgotten, you know, we really need to look back to see forward again. But through their efforts, you know, they built homes and families came. You might be surprised that some of these little towns had quite the life. In the little town of Bonanza, which is just below the Custer, there were 5 hotels, and there were hardware shops and tobacconists and candy stores. And you know, the people would get together. This is probably some Sunday getting together for a picnic somewhere. But anyway, those days are gone. You're not supposed to go out in the forest and pan for your gold, find your fortune. In the Yankee Fork, the land of the Yankee Fork, where this is all a part of, the state has now a park, and they've built quite an expensive museum that shows all the history, and it's interesting to go through. But one of the things that they'll tell you is that the old timers got all the gold. And they want to tell you that because they don't want you out there in the forest digging around. It's unfortunate, though, as I mentioned, Idaho has some of the most important strategic metals that are necessary for America to continue to be an industrialized nation. So my story in the mining business began working a placer operation. This is the family placer operation. I was about 10 years old, and we would load this ore bin up and wash the rock down the sluice boxes to the right side there. And we worked by hand. In those days, this is late 60s now, you know, people used to farm 20 acres too. Well, at this time there were several mining camps up the area. And every Wednesday night we'd have a little get-together, sit around the campfire and play guitar and roast marshmallows and hot dogs. But there's none anymore. I'm the last of them up this Yankee Fork. But in those days, we really had a small community of people that were out looking for their fortune. It was 1969, and I can remember crawling up to the top of the mountain behind us and tuning in so I could get radio reception to listen to the moon landing. And I thought, as a 10-year-old boy, this is just an amazing thing. You know, Americans could do anything. Here we developed the world, and now we're going to space. And I was a very proud young man at that time, and I thought that maybe the world was my oyster. Whatever I could dream, just like the pioneers of the past, I could do. This is the White Cloud Mountains that I showed you previously, a close-up. It was just about this time, 1970, that ASARCO, that's American Smelting and Refining Company, found $2 billion worth of molybdenum in the Frog Lake area of this zone. That is 10 times richer than the current molybdenum mine that we have up Thompson Creek. But people would not have that. They locked it away in what's called the Sawtooth National Recreation Area. And although ASARCO still has the mineral rights, there's no way they can mine them. It's on federal property. What it did do is it locked future generations of Idahoans and people in Custer County out of opportunities to have good paying jobs. And it locked out one heck of a reserve of molybdenum that we now rely on foreign sources for the most part. Well, here's how it all started. 1969, I thought that we were really doing well, and then they shut the mine, the opportunity to explore the ASARCO project. And in Congress, here's some of the acts that followed up, that brought the legislation, that brought the regulators, that brought the bureaucrats, that made all the rules that ran the miners off. And so, as you can see, there's been a progressive movement to make congressional acts that are now used as weapons to keep people off of the land. It began in the water laws. It continued in the federal land acts, the Wilderness Act, Surface Mining Control Act. These areas have now been designated as wilderness study areas. And so they don't want people in those areas, even though there's huge mineral reserves. Our famous Senator Frank Church locked up a big chunk of central Idaho, and he locked up with it a lot of future for this nation and our country. But anyway, these acts forbid people to develop, and it's because of some of these acts that they're now trying to get people off of the lands through this RS 2477 road right-of-way business. And finally, it all came down to the Wildlife Acts, the Endangered Species Act. These are all meant on paper, and it looks pretty good on paper. Everybody loves the animals. But they don't realize the consequences of these acts. And the consequences are there for everyone to see. Like I mentioned, those great elk herds are gone. The wolves have destroyed much of them. They're destroying ranchers' livestock, their cattle, their sheep. And it's just another opportunity for the federal government to encroach further upon your rights. And what they're trying to do is run people off the range. They're running them. They've got the timbermen gone. The beetle kills wiped all of them out. I'm probably the last small gold miner. There's a molybdenum mine that does employ people in our area. But we tried to fight this. Well, I should say we, my dad did. In the 70s, we were mining on that placer claim, and we had some settling ponds, and a federal agent came and they were taking samples out of our tailings ponds. And the guy was using his sandwich bags And my dad went down there and told him, you're not following proper protocol for taking these samples. Well, the argument ensued, and my dad got a little hot-headed with the guy and told him he was going to shoot him. And he was on that little motorbike, this little Forest Service guy, and he throws him on that bike, and I was still a pretty young kid, and I'm in the truck with Dad, and Dad's just 2 inches from his back tire driving about 50 miles an hour down that road. And that guy was glad to get off of our claims at the time. Well, we were pretty chuffed with ourselves. We thought we were tough. The next morning, 2 marshals out of Boise came up, guns out, and they arrested my father, and they were gonna make a good example of him. Well, miraculously, we went to trial. I was sure my mom was going to be a prison widow. I would have to send the file in the cake, or is it the cake in the file, to my dad in prison. But anyway, during the trial, the judge was looking at him kind of funny, and you could see there was a light bulb go off on his head, and he realized that he knew my father. And he realized that it was my dad that tutored him through calculus class at the University of Idaho. And he said, "Mr. Moon, I know you're a good man." He says, "I'm not going to recuse myself because I'm so far into this trial." But he said, "I am going to pass judgment on you." And he sentenced him to 80 hours of public service, community service, to work out what the problems were with the local miners and the Forest Service. Well, this is exactly what they did not want. Because my dad, with court mandate in hand, went down to the region supervisor's office and pulled all the files. And they said, "No, Mr. Moon, you can go now. That's fine." "Oh, no, sir. I've got to pay my due." And he stayed there. And they couldn't stand that, So they were glad to see when Mr. Moon's 80 hours of community service were up. And that's really the last time I've seen justice up the Yankee Fork. Well, in 1983, through our efforts, we were able to patent 2 mining claims up on Jordan Creek of the Yankee Fork. And these were about the last mineral patents given. You can't do that today. Used to be you could file a mineral claim on federal lands and improve it, much like the Homestead Act. And if you could prove that it was economic, the government would deed you the property. Well, this was deeded to us the end of 1983, 1984. And it just kind of sat there for a long time until my wife and my 2 boys and I decided we would come back to Idaho. We were living in near Branson, Missouri at the time. And my boys were faced with the opportunity to go into a middle school that had like 1,200 kids, and some of them had the big pork chops and the bones in their noses and the tattoos and the weird hair. And we decided we're not going to do that. And so we built this cabin. We just built it. I drew it up one winter, and we came out and built it. My boys went to a 2-room schoolhouse in Stanley, Idaho. And we lived through the winter up there, and my wife, she's in the back here, she taught at the Stanley School. And so we raised our kids in the wilderness. We're off the grid here. We don't have a power line, you might notice. We do use solar power when we can use it. And we have a small little generator that we use when we need to. But I'm living the dream. I made this piece of property happen by my own sweat when I was a younger man. And I'm proud to have built this and raised my family here. And I think it's sad that you don't have that chance. That window has been closed. That opportunity no longer exists. And I would tell you that on our little cabin, in our little 10 acres in the woods here, that our forest is a lot better than the national forest because we have a vested interest to take care of it. And it's very sad that we used to see just about every May 25th, that's my wife's birthday, we would see deer come up and it seemed like that happened every year, and they don't come up anymore. And to make matters worse, your government has seen fit to take money and buy in holdings in the national forest. So these old homesteads and these old mining claims are being bought out by the federal government and put back into the national forest. And they've taken, in this case, $700 million from drilling fees to purchase these in-holdings. And when they purchase these in-holdings in a county where there's only 3% private property, they take another chunk of that taxable income away from us. So it further exacerbates the problem. The recent transportation bill had $900 million, I believe, put into it to buy additional in-holdings. So when they run the privateer off and they bought them all out, they can just walk away and lock it up. Another front that we're attacked on is from MSHA. This is an article from the California Mining Journal. It's really quite an interesting publication. It gives a lot of the lay of the land as far as the law goes, and kind of the trade magazine for the prospector and miner of the day. MSHA is much like OSHA. They regulate the mining industry. They did not used to regulate family operations, but they do now. And MSHA has been tasked with further harassing mining operations by levying fines. The article goes on to talk about in 2005, they fined, I believe, a total of $40 million to mining companies, mostly mining companies, big mining companies. Here, 2011, it's over $160 million in fines. And they're doing that not to keep myself safer. They're doing a lot of that so that we can be bankrupted by a government that is harassing us. And so I found that was kind of an interesting article. But here's the reward. This is some of the gold that we get up on Estes Mountain where I'm working. It's spectacular. There's a lot of gold in Idaho. There's a lot of gold in America. In fact, there's a lot of resources in America. It's all here. We just have to go find it. And I want to encourage you to go out and occupy America. Stake your claim. Find your gold, you know, and be a thorn in their side. Because if there's 20,000 of us out there with mining claims, who in their right mind is going to tell you to get off the land? There's Dorothy with a few nuggets in her hands. And here's some of Idaho's resources that we do have. We've got the only source of cobalt in North America. They're trying to work that on a mining project right now. Of course, gold, silver, the rare earths, metals, thorium, tungsten, and where they're located. And it says, although Idaho produces little gold, the United States Bureau of Mines says that we have more mineable gold than any other state. And I think I can testify to that. So join me in my humble, with my briefcase here, 2 buckets, on our little mining operation here on top of a mountain in central Idaho. That's my boys hammering rocks, you know. It's not too much different than being in prison, so I guess we're getting used to it. We beat big rocks into little rocks, and here they're knocking them through the grizzly. And here's some of the equipment and part of the mining operation. You can see it's pretty steep. We're right up on top of a mountain. This is just about 9,400 feet elevation. And there's an old timer with the old draw works. So it's kind of a look forward and a look back. And with that, I've got a couple of white papers that my wife is going to hand out. They're really just kind of a history of Custer and a few pictures. I really want to inspire you to come out and see us in central Idaho. I want you to go out and stake your claim, because that is a property right. And I hope this inspires you to do that. Thank you very much for your time.